Welcome to Reflections from the Supper to the Cross. This online experience was crafted to give us a window into the events that led up to the triumphant resurrection of Jesus. The vibe of this service may seem a bit bleak, but you see, it's important for us in order to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus to first reconcile the fact that he was indeed dead. Together, we will journey through the final hours of Jesus' life here on earth, from the supper, through the garden, and ultimately to the cross. This is a time for us to reflect. Take a moment to quiet your soul. Allow your mind to journey to these far-off places and monumental moments. Pay attention to the words that are said and sung. Jesus, be our guide. It all starts here in the upper room. This is a second story room at a local's home that was set aside for Jesus to meet with his friends. It's a safe space. It's a space of fellowship, a space to listen, a space to learn, and most importantly, it's a space to eat. In this room, Jesus is surrounded by his closest friends and followers for a Passover meal. This ceremonial meal recalls the mercy of God to the Israelites in Egypt, a significant moment in biblical history where the blood of a lamb was placed on the doorframe of those who believed so that the Spirit of God would pass over them, sparing their families. But Jesus used this supper to teach a truth that would change everything. Jesus chose the Passover meal to say that the whole of Scripture is about me, is about him, that he will fulfill it by demonstrating the ultimate service. Jesus said, this meal is significant because I am the one serving you. In fact, I am the one being served. I am the meal. Luke 22 says that Jesus looked at his friends in the room and he said this to them, you have no idea how much I've looked forward to this meal with you before I enter into my time of suffering. It's the last one that I'll eat with you before we eat together again in the kingdom of God. Jesus then looks towards the table spread out before them, towards a loaf of bread. He does four things to the bread. He takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it. He says, this is my body given for you. Eat it and remember me. Likewise, Jesus takes a cup and he says about this cup that this cup is the new covenant written in my blood, blood that will be poured out for you. You see, Jesus knew what was coming. He knew what had to be done. Just imagine the weight of burden that he felt in that moment. Jesus goes on to say that someone here at this table among us now would ultimately be the one who would betray him. Maybe, like me, you've always considered yourself to be among the 11 rather than having anything in common with Judas. We convince ourselves that surely we would not be the one that Jesus pointed out as the betrayer. But in reality, we come to this table much like Judas, having already betrayed Christ in our hearts. It is our sin that sent him on this journey to the cross. It is our betrayal that made this suffering necessary for him. And that's the scandalous beauty of the table. Judas came to the upper room having already betrayed Christ in his heart, yet Jesus invited him into the meal anyway. Because even though we are not worthy of this meal, Jesus invites us to his table. For it is this very meal that makes us one with Christ. So friends, now is the time for us to partake in this meal together. Use whatever you have on hand. Come to the table. Share in the blood and the body of Jesus. Do this in remembrance of him.
Take the bread of life, broken for all my sin, your body crucified to make me whole again. I will recall the cup poured out in sacrifice to trade the sinner's end for your new covenant. Hallelujah. I live my life in remembrance. Hallelujah. Your promise I won't forget. I walk salvation's road with fear and trembling, your wave worn as my own, as Christ is formed in me. If ever I should lose my way, if ever I deny your grace, remind me of the price you paid. Hallelujah. 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 I live in remembrance.
The Gospels tell us that after Jesus shared the Passover meal with his disciples, they went together to a place called Gethsemane. The site today is marked by a small grove of olive trees, which leads us to associate this prayer with a garden. However, the term Gethsemane is a Greek approximation of an Aramaic term that refers to an oil vat or an oil press. It would have been a tool used for making olive oil, a process that is characterized by intense pressure. So while we are quick to think of Jesus praying quietly in a pleasant garden, it's helpful to remember that Gethsemane is a place that is marked by intense pressure for Jesus. At this point in the story, Jesus is well aware of what is to come. He knows that the cross is merely hours away, and so he does the only logical thing. He prays. But this is not some quiet, peaceful, quiet time prayer that we might imagine it to be. Mark describes Jesus as deeply distressed and troubled. Jesus actually confides in his closest friends by saying, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," and then proceeds to fall down on his face and cry out in prayer, saying, "Abba, Father," which is to say, Dad. And so he cries out to his Father and says, "Everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Luke, the gospel writing physician, records some unique details about this story. He says that Jesus, being in anguish, prayed more earnestly, and that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground, a condition today we know as hematidrosis, a rare condition in which individuals under extreme pressure will actually sweat droplets of blood. Given what lies before Jesus in the practical, physical sense, but also in this cosmological, theological sense of taking on the sins of the world, it would be impossible to exaggerate the pressure that Jesus is experiencing at this moment. If ever someone carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, it was Jesus in this moment. And so whatever weight you may carry, the story of Jesus at Gethsemane reminds me, and it reminds you, that we do not have to carry that weight alone. Fully God, but as this passage clearly illustrates, also fully man. In view is the crucifixion and the cup of God's judgment that he is about to drink, wrestling with what lays before him, and yet obedient to the Father's will, even to the point of death on a cross. Under the strain of this impossible weight, Jesus affirms the Father's will, and in doing so declares to you and to me, "You're worth it because you are loved." And it's at this moment that Jesus rises, strengthened from prayer, to the sound of a crowd coming to arrest him.
Savior, I come, quiet my soul. Remember, redemption's here, where your blood was spilled for my ransom, and everything I once held dear, I count it all as a loss. Lead me to the cross where your love poured out, and bring me to my knees. Lord, I lay me down and rid me of myself. I belong to you. Oh, lead me to the cross. You were as I, tempted and tried, human, became flesh, bore my sin and death. Now you're risen. Oh, and everything I once held dear, I count it all as a loss. Lead me to the cross where your love poured out, and bring me to my knees. Lord, I lay me down and rid me of myself. I belong to you. Oh, lead me. Lead me to the cross where your love poured out, and bring me to my knees. Lord, I lay me down and rid me of myself. I belong to you. Oh, lead me. Lead me to the cross.
We've all had bad days and bad weeks, but what Jesus experienced in his last days is absolutely unimaginable. He's betrayed by one of his closest friends, then he's arrested, put on trial, and found guilty for crimes that he did not commit, and then he's sentenced to the death of all deaths, crucifixion. And there was no appeals process, there was no possibility of a mistrial. No, the judgment had been rendered, and the journey to the cross began. And the journey was gruesome and cruel and barbaric. It wasn't one of those, hey, you're going to be executed tomorrow. What do you want for your last meal? No, they stripped him naked. They took a crown of thorns and they twisted and they shoved it into his skull. Then they mocked him. Then they spit on him. And then they beat him over and over and over. They whipped and scourged and beat him beyond recognition. And if that wasn't enough, they then force him to carry his own cross to the place of his death. They get there, and then the guards, they grab these spikes and they drive them through his wrists and through his ankles. And once they got him on there and got him on there good, then they raised the cross for the world to see. And there he was, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the Messiah, the one who came to save the world, the one who came to set the captives free. There he is. All of the Gospels give us descriptions of his death, and every time I read through them, there are things that completely overwhelm me. One of them is found in John 19. It says this: "Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, 'Woman, here is your son.'" Can you imagine? Can you imagine what it must have been like when they locked eyes? Can you imagine what Jesus felt as he looks down and he sees his mother looking at him nailed to a cross? He looks down at her, and in her eyes, he can see her desperation and her devastation. He knows what's to come, but he knows that she doesn't. And all he can do in these moments for her is to just hang there in front of her. And then you have Mary looking up at the cross and seeing her son, her baby boy, who is bruised and beaten and bloody, hanging on a cross. Her baby boy that she loved more than life itself. The thought of what was happening in those moments is absolutely overwhelming, and I don't want us to miss it. I don't want us to miss it. I think sometimes we get so focused on the deity of Jesus that we miss his humanity. We miss that he really experienced this. This really happened. This pain was real. This suffering was real. He endured it all. And you would think in those moments, his focus would be on him, focused on his pain and his suffering and his loss, but that's not what we see. No, in Luke chapter 23, it says this: 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." It's been said how we respond in our darkest moments reveals who we truly are, and that was certainly the case with Jesus. On the cross, there was no mistake about who he was and what he was all about, because he wasn't there for him, he was there for us. He wasn't suffering for him, he was suffering for us. He wasn't dying for himself, he was dying for us. He was hanging there because of love and freedom and forgiveness and life and victory. He was hanging there for you and for me. 1 John 3:16 says, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us." Jesus died for us. And again, I don't want us to miss this, and I don't want us to move past this. I want it to sink in. Let it sink in. Let the weight sink in. Let the love sink in. Let the hopelessness and the defeat and the death sink in. Let it sink in deep down into your heart and into your soul, because all of it was for you and for me. After he accomplished everything he needed to accomplish, he pushed down on the stakes that were in his wrists and in his ankles, and he took one last breath. And as he took that breath, he declared, "It is finished." Is it really finished though? Like, is this really how things are going to end? I mean, has hope and freedom been lost forever? And if so, why? Why, God? Like, why would you do this? Where are you? What are you doing? What good could possibly come from this? Only time will tell. Only time will tell.